The rain drummed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse office as 19-year-old Yuna Kim clutched the contract with trembling fingers. The papers felt heavier than they should, each clause a chain binding her to a future she never imagined. Across the mahogany desk sat Lee Jihan, 32, CEO of Stellar Corporation, his dark eyes as unforgiving as winter storms. "Read it carefully," his voice cut through the silence like shattered glass. "Once you sign, there's no going back." Yuna's eyes scanned the terms again. Marriage for 2 years, no emotional attachment, complete discretion. In return, her younger brother's medical bills would be covered and her family's debts erased. The pen felt foreign in her grip as she glanced at the man who would become her husband. His sharp jawline remained set, betraying nothing of the thoughts behind those calculating eyes. The office smelled of expensive leather and coffee, a stark contrast to the cramped hospital room where her brother lay fighting for his life. She thought of his pale face, the machines keeping him alive, their mother's tears that never seemed to stop. This contract wasn't just paper and ink, it was salvation wrapped in sacrifice. "Why me?" she whispered, finally meeting his gaze. Jihan's expression didn't soften. "You need money. I need a wife. It's purely transactional." But something flickered in his eyes, gone too quickly to decipher. Yuna pressed the pen to paper, her signature sealing a fate neither of them could foresee. Outside, lightning illuminated the city skyline, as if the heavens themselves were marking this moment. The contract was signed, but their real story was just beginning. The courthouse ceremony lasted exactly 12 minutes. Yuna stood beside Jihan in a simple white dress she'd borrowed from her roommate, while he wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than her family's monthly rent. No flowers, no music, no guests, just 2 witnesses pulled from the hallway and a judge who seemed more interested in his lunch than their vows. "Do you, Lee Jihan, take Kim Yuna to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do." His voice was steady, businesslike, as if he were closing another corporate deal. When it was her turn, Yuna's voice caught in her throat. The weight of what she was doing crashed over her like a tidal wave. At 19, she was becoming Mrs. Lee, bound to a man who looked at her like she was merely another asset to be managed. The ring he slipped onto her finger was beautiful, a simple platinum band with a modest diamond that caught the fluorescent courthouse lighting. It felt cold against her skin, a perfect metaphor for their arrangement. When the judge pronounced them husband and wife, there was no kiss, just a curt nod from Jihan. "The car is waiting," he said, already checking his phone. As they walked down the courthouse steps, Yuna caught her reflection in the building's glass doors. She looked like a child playing dress-up, completely out of place beside this powerful man who now legally owned a piece of her life. The black sedan that waited for them was pristine, its interior smelling of expensive cologne and leather. "Your belongings will be moved to the penthouse tonight," Jihan informed her as they drove through Seoul's busy streets. "Mrs. Park will show you to your room." Your room. Not our room. The distinction wasn't lost on her. The penthouse occupied the entire top floor of Seoul's most exclusive residential tower. As the elevator doors opened directly into the foyer, Yuna felt like Alice tumbling down the rabbit hole into a world that defied everything she'd known. Marble floors stretched endlessly, reflecting the light from crystal chandeliers that probably cost more than her family's entire apartment. Mrs. Park, the housekeeper, was a woman in her 50s, with kind eyes and a gentle smile that immediately put Yuna at ease. "Welcome home, Mrs. Lee," she said, the title sounding foreign to Yuna's ears. "Please, just call me Yuna," she replied, her voice echoing in the vast space. Mrs. Park led her through rooms that seemed designed for magazine spreads rather than actual living. The living room featured floor-to-ceiling windows, offering a panoramic view of Seoul's skyline. Modern art adorned the walls, and everything was pristine, untouched, cold. "Mr. Lee's study is off limits," Mrs. Park explained as they passed a heavy oak door. "He works late most nights. Your room is this way." The bedroom was larger than Yuna's family's entire apartment. A king-sized bed dominated the space, draped in silk sheets the color of champagne. The walk-in closet was already filled with clothes in her exact size, elegant dresses, designer shoes, jewelry that sparkled under the soft lighting. "How did he know my size?" Yuna asked, running her fingers over a cashmere sweater. Mrs. Park's smile was mysterious. "Mr. Lee is very thorough in his business dealings." Business dealings. That's all this was to him. As Yuna stood alone in her gilded cage, watching the city lights twinkle below, she wondered if she'd made a deal with the devil himself. Breakfast was served at exactly 7:30 in the morning in a dining room that could seat 12, but housed only 2. Jihan sat at the head of the table, reading financial reports while mechanically eating his meal. Yuna took the seat to his right, feeling like an intruder in this perfectly orchestrated routine. "We need to establish some ground rules," he said without looking up from his papers. His voice carried the same tone he might use in a board meeting. Yuna set down her coffee cup, the delicate china making a soft clink against the saucer. "I'm listening. Public appearances will be minimal but necessary. When we do appear together, you'll play the role of the devoted wife. No personal questions to the media. No social media posts about our marriage or personal life." He finally looked at her, his dark eyes assessing. "Can you handle that?" "I'm not a child," she replied, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. Something almost like approval flickered across his features. "Good. Your allowance will be deposited monthly. Use it for whatever you need. Clothes, personal expenses. Mrs. Park will handle everything else." "What about my family, my brother's treatment?" "Already arranged. The best oncologist in Seoul is handling his case." He returned to his papers, effectively dismissing her. But Yuna wasn't finished. "What about us? I mean, what are we supposed to be to each other when we're alone?" Jihan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "We're business partners, nothing more. Don't confuse this arrangement with something it's not." His words stung more than they should have. As he left for work, Yuna remained at the table, surrounded by luxury, but feeling more alone than ever. The golden cage was beautiful, but it was still a cage. 3 weeks into their marriage, Jihan informed Yuna they would attend the annual Stella Corporation charity gala. "It's important that we present a united front," he explained, his tone suggesting this was another business strategy rather than their first public appearance as husband and wife. The dress he'd chosen for her was stunning. Midnight blue silk that hugged her figure perfectly and fell in elegant waves to the floor. The matching jewelry was understated, but clearly expensive. As Yuna looked at herself in the mirror, she barely recognized the sophisticated woman staring back. "You look appropriate," Jihan said when she emerged from her room. It wasn't exactly a compliment, but coming from him, it felt like one. The gala was held at Seoul's most prestigious hotel. As their car pulled up to the red carpet, Yuna's nerves threatened to overwhelm her. Cameras flashed as Jihan helped her from the vehicle, his hand warm and steady on her elbow. "Smile," he murmured near her ear, his breath sending an unexpected shiver down her spine. "Remember, we're madly in love." The irony wasn't lost on her as they posed for photographs, his arm around her waist, both of them smiling for the cameras while maintaining the emotional distance of strangers. Inside the ballroom, Seoul's elite mingled beneath crystal chandeliers, their conversations a mixture of business deals and social gossip. "Mrs. Lee," a woman approached them, her smile sharp as a blade. "How lovely to finally meet Jihan's mysterious bride." Yuna felt Jihan's hand tighten almost protectively on her waist as he smoothly deflected the woman's probing questions. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine this was real, that she truly was the cherished wife of this powerful, enigmatic man. The morning after the gala, Yuna found Jihan in his study, door ajar, speaking in hushed, urgent tones on the phone. She wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but his voice carried a desperation she'd never heard before. "I don't care what it costs," he was saying. "Find her. It's been 5 years, there has to be something." Yuna froze in the hallway, her coffee cup trembling in her hands. Who was he looking for? The conversation ended abruptly, and she quickly retreated to the kitchen before he could discover her presence. That afternoon, while Jihan was at work, Yuna found herself drawn to his study. The door was locked, but Mrs. Park had left her master key on the kitchen counter. Guilt warred with curiosity as she turned the key and stepped inside. The room was a shrine to success. Awards, photographs with world leaders, certificates of achievement. But tucked in the corner of his desk was a small, framed photograph that made her breath catch. A young woman with gentle eyes and a radiant smile, someone who looked nothing like Yuna, but whose presence seemed to fill the room with warmth. Her name was Soyoung. Yuna spun around to find Mrs. Park in the doorway, her expression sad but understanding. "Mr. Lee's first love," the housekeeper continued. "She disappeared 5 years ago, just before their engagement was to be announced. He's never stopped looking for her." The photograph suddenly felt heavy in Yuna's hands. Everything made sense now. The emotional distance, the clinical nature of their arrangement, the way he sometimes looked through her as if she were invisible. She wasn't his wife. She was a placeholder, a temporary solution, while he searched for the woman who'd stolen his heart and vanished with it. Yuna's brother Minho looked better than he had in months. The private room at Seoul National University Hospital was a far cry from the overcrowded ward where he'd been before her marriage. Sunlight streamed through large windows, and the medical equipment hummed quietly in the background. "You look different," Minho observed as she arranged fresh flowers in a vase. At 15, he was perceptive beyond his years, illness having forced him to grow up too quickly. "Different how?" Yuna asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. "Sadder, lonelier." He studied her face with the intensity of someone who'd spent too much time observing the world from a hospital bed. "Marriage isn't what you expected, is it?" Yuna forced a smile. "I'm fine. You're getting better, and that's all that matters." But Minho wasn't fooled. "I've seen him on the news, your husband. He looks like the kind of man who's forgotten how to smile." Before Yuna could respond, the door opened and Jihan walked in. She hadn't expected him. He'd never visited before. He looked out of place in the sterile hospital environment, his expensive suit and commanding presence at odds with the gentle atmosphere of healing. "Mr. Lee," Minho said, struggling to sit up straighter. "Please, don't get up." Jihan's voice was gentler than Yuna had ever heard it. "How are you feeling?" As the two talked, Yuna watched in amazement. This wasn't the cold CEO she'd married, but someone warmer, more human. He asked intelligent questions about Minho's treatment, listened carefully to the answers, and even managed a small smile when her brother made a joke. "Thank you," Minho said suddenly, "for everything. I know this isn't... I know why my sister married you." Jihan's eyes met Yuna's across the bed, and for a moment, something unspoken passed between them. The argument started over something trivial. Yuna had rearranged some books in the living room, but it quickly escalated into something much deeper. Jihan stood in the center of their pristine living room, his usually perfect composure cracking like ice under pressure. "You can't just change things without asking," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "They're just books," Yuna replied, but she could see this wasn't really about books at all. "Nothing in this house changes without my permission. Nothing. His hands were clenched at his sides, and for the first time since she'd known him, he looked vulnerable rather than powerful. "What are you so afraid of?" The question escaped before she could stop it. The silence that followed was deafening. Outside, rain began to fall against the windows, the sound filling the space between them. Jihan's face had gone pale, and when he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm afraid that if I let anything change, I'll lose what little control I have left." The admission hung in the air, like a confession. Yuna took a step toward him, then another, until she was close enough to see the pain he kept so carefully hidden behind his cold facade. "You don't have to control everything," she said softly. "Sometimes letting go is the only way to move forward." For a moment she thought he might reach for her, might let down the walls he'd built so carefully around his heart. But then his phone rang, shattering the moment like glass. He answered it with his usual professional tone, the vulnerable man disappearing behind the CEO mask once again. But Yuna had seen him, the real him, and that changed everything. The private investigator's report arrived on a Tuesday morning while Jihan was in meetings. Mrs. Park signed for the envelope, her face grave, as she handed it to Yuna. The return address made it clear what it contained: news about Soyoung. Yuna stared at the envelope for hours, torn between curiosity and respect for her husband's privacy. Finally, as evening approached and Jihan still hadn't returned, she made her decision. The contents would affect their marriage, their future, and she had a right to know. The photographs fell out first, surveillance images of a woman who looked like the one from Jihan's desk, but older, thinner, with hollow eyes and track marks on her arms. The report was clinical in its details. Soyoung had been found in a rehabilitation center in Busan, struggling with addiction and living under an assumed name. But it was the final page that made Yuna's blood run cold. Soyoung had been married for 3 years to another man, a fellow patient she'd met in rehab. She had 2 children and had explicitly stated she wanted no contact with her past life, including Lee Jihan. When Jihan arrived home that night, he found Yuna waiting in his study, the report spread across his desk. His face went through a series of emotions: anger, betrayal, and finally a grief so profound it took her breath away. "You had no right," he said, but there was no real anger in his voice, only exhaustion. "I had every right," Yuna replied gently. "I'm your wife." "You're my employee," he corrected, but the words lacked conviction. "No," she said, standing to face him. "I'm the woman who's been watching you torture yourself for 5 years over someone who chose to leave. I'm the woman who's here, now, ready to build something real, if you'll let her." Jihan didn't come home for 3 days. Mrs. Park mentioned he was staying at his office, working around the clock, but Yuna knew better. He was running from the truth about Soyoung, from the feelings that had been growing between them, from the possibility of letting someone new into his carefully guarded heart. On the 4th day, Yuna made a decision. She dressed carefully in one of the elegant outfits he'd bought her and took a taxi to Stella Corporation. The receptionist tried to stop her, but Yuna walked past with the confidence of a woman who belonged there. She found him in his office, looking haggard and defeated. Empty coffee cups littered his desk, and his usually immaculate appearance was disheveled. He looked up when she entered, surprise flickering across his features. "You shouldn't be here," he said, but he didn't ask her to leave. "Where else should I be? I'm your wife. You're my responsibility. There's a difference." Yuna moved closer, her heart pounding. "Is that really what you think? After everything we've shared, all the moments when your mask slipped and I saw the real you?" Jihan stood abruptly, moving to the window that overlooked the city. "You don't understand. I won't put you through what I put her through." "What you put her through?" Yuna's voice was incredulous. "Jihan, She left. She chose to leave. You didn't drive her away. She was already gone. When he turned back to her, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. I loved her, and it wasn't enough. Maybe, Yuna said softly, you loved the idea of her. But love isn't about holding on to the past. It's about choosing someone every day, even when it's difficult. She moved closer until she was standing directly in front of him. I'm choosing you, Jihan, every day, despite the contract, despite the walls you've built. I'm choosing us. The moment stretched between them like a bridge neither had dared to cross before. Jihan's eyes searched her face as if trying to memorize every detail, and Yuna could see the war raging behind his careful composure. Duty against desire, past against present, fear against hope. Yuna, he whispered her name like a prayer, his hand rising to cup her cheek. His touch was gentle, reverent, nothing like the cold businessman who had married her months ago. I'm here, she replied, covering his hand with hers. I'm not going anywhere. When he kissed her, it was with the desperation of a drowning man finding shore. All the walls he'd built, all the careful distance he'd maintained, crumbled in that single moment of connection. His lips were soft against hers, tasting of coffee and possibility, and Yuna felt her heart soar with the realization that this was real, not part of their contract, not for show, but genuine emotion finally breaking free. They broke apart breathless, foreheads touching, sharing the same air in the golden light filtering through his office windows. The city sprawled below them, but in that moment, their world had narrowed to just the two of them. I don't know how to do this, Jihan admitted, his voice rough with emotion. I don't know how to let someone in. We'll figure it out together, Yuna promised, her thumb tracing the line of his jaw. One day at a time. He pulled her closer, holding her as if she might disappear like morning mist. I'm scared, he confessed against her hair. I'm scared of losing you too. Then don't let me go, she whispered back. And for the first time since she'd known him, Lee Jihan smiled, really smiled, and Yuna saw the man he could be when he wasn't afraid to love. 6 months later, their penthouse felt like a home rather than a museum. Yuna had gradually added touches of warmth, soft throws on the modern furniture, family photographs on the stark walls, fresh flowers that filled the rooms with life and color. Jihan had initially resisted the changes, but slowly he began to appreciate the transformation. Your brother called, he said one evening as they shared dinner at the kitchen island rather than the formal dining room. His latest scans came back clear. Yuna's face lit up with joy, and Jihan felt that familiar warmth in his chest that her happiness always brought him. They'd been taking things slowly, rebuilding their relationship on a foundation of honesty rather than contract terms. He wants to meet you properly, she said, not as the man who saved his life, but as my husband. The word husband still sent a thrill through him when she said it with such genuine affection. I'd like that. And they'd been sleeping in separate rooms still, both afraid to rush what was growing between them. But that night, as Yuna prepared for bed, she found Jihan standing in the hallway between their rooms, looking uncertain. I was thinking, he began, then stopped, running a hand through his hair in a gesture she'd learned meant he was nervous. What were you thinking? She encouraged gently. Maybe it's time we shared a room. Really shared one. If you want to, that is. Yuna's heart raced, but she kept her voice steady. I'd like that very much. That night they lay in the king-sized bed that had once felt too large for one person, talking quietly in the darkness about their dreams, their fears, their hopes for the future. When Jihan finally fell asleep, his arm around her waist, Yuna marveled at how far they'd come from that cold contract signing in his office. The second contract arrived exactly 2 years after their wedding day. Yuna found it on Jihan's desk, divorce papers meticulously prepared, with financial settlements that would set her up for life. The sight of them made her stomach drop, even though she'd known this day would come. Jihan found her there an hour later, staring at the papers with tears streaming down her face. "You don't have to sign them," he said quietly from the doorway. "Our agreement was for 2 years," she replied without looking up. "Your obligation is fulfilled." "Is that what you think this is? An obligation?" He moved closer, his voice gaining strength. "Yuna, look at me." When she finally met his eyes, she saw not the cold CEO she'd married, but the man who'd learned to love again, who'd chosen vulnerability over safety, who'd built a life with her that neither of them had expected. "I don't want a divorce," he said simply. "I want a real marriage. With you. For as long as you'll have me." "Even though I'm not her?" The question had haunted Yuna for months. Jihan knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. "You're not her, and I'm grateful for that every day. You're Yuna, the woman who saw past my walls, who challenged me to be better, who chose to love me even when I couldn't love myself. You're the woman I want to grow old with." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside was a ring, not the practical band from their contract wedding, but something beautiful and unique, with a stone that caught the light like captured starfire. "Marry me again," he said. "Not because of a contract, not out of obligation, but because we choose each other, because what we have is real." Through her tears, Yuna saw their future stretching ahead, messy and uncertain, but filled with love. "Yes," she whispered, and then louder, "Yes." 1 year later, they renewed their vows in a small ceremony, surrounded by the people who mattered most. Minho, healthy and strong, walked Yuna down the aisle of the garden where they'd chosen to marry. Mrs. Park dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, and even Jihan's stern father managed to smile as his son promised to love, honor, and cherish the young woman who'd changed everything. This time, when the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Jihan kissed her with all the love he'd been afraid to show before. The guests cheered, and Yuna laughed against his lips, her heart so full she thought it might burst. Later, as they danced under string lights in their garden, Jihan whispered in her ear, "Do you ever regret it, signing that first contract?" Yuna looked up at him. This man who'd started as a stranger, become her husband in name only, and finally transformed into her true partner in every sense of the word. "Never," she said firmly. "It brought me to you, even though I was impossible at first. Especially because you were impossible. It made earning your love that much sweeter." Madine. As the evening wound down and their guests departed, Jihan and Yuna stood on their terrace overlooking the city where their story had begun. Seoul sparkled below them like scattered diamonds, and the future stretched ahead full of promise. "What happens now?" Yuna asked, leaning into his warmth. "Now," Jihan said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head, "we live happily ever after." Indeed. And in the penthouse that had once been a prison but had become a home, they did exactly that. 2 hearts that had found each other against all odds, proving that sometimes the best love stories begin with the most unlikely contracts.